In the 1960s and the 1970s, the race for a supersonic transport aircraft had been heating up. The debut of Concorde in the early 1960s, and then the surprise revelation of the Soviet Tu-144 Konkordsky meant the world was suddenly gripped in a supersonic airliner fever. Having led the way in commercial aviation for many years now, the United States suddenly feared that its advantage in the commercial sector might suddenly vanish. And indeed, large American airlines such as Pan Am started placing orders for Concorde. The United States believed that they needed a supersonic transport of their own. So, to start covering off the threat of the Anglo-French airliner, President John F. Kennedy committed to the U.S. government subsidizing an American supersonic airliner by some 75%, and the race was on to become the first American SST. Several proposals were submitted to become the chosen aircraft, and ultimately the Boeing 2707 was what was chosen to be built. But, had the contract for the airliner gone to Lockheed with their L-2000, then things could have turned out a little differently for the United States Supersonic Transport Program. It may even have entered commercial service. Earlier designs. By Lockheed, the L-2000 might have been what Lockheed ultimately submitted for the SST project, but the company had been working on other designs for the aircraft prior to that particular aircraft. Its first efforts can be seen in 1958, and the company later came up with the design of the CL-823. This used a cranked arrow wing with canards at the front of the aircraft to aid lift and had its engines buried into the wings. It was certainly an interesting design, but one that ultimately became nothing more than a design study. The L-2000 would be a totally different kettle of fish from the CL-823. The L-2000 was of a compound delta design with podded engines and looked much more like Concorde than the swing-wing Boeing design. Lockheed chose the fixed delta wing as they believed that, thanks to the mechanism needed for the swing-wing design, that it would be simply too heavy. The final design, which was dubbed L-2007, would have a seating capacity for 5 abreast seating and a 4 abreast arrangement when it came to the first-class sections of the aircraft. In theory, the aircraft would have been capable of carrying 273 people at maximum capacity, over 100 more than on Concorde. Expected performance of the L-2000. Of course, we know that the L-2000 wasn't selected over the Boeing 2707, but its performance figures could have been impressive. It was set to be powered by either 4 General Electric GE 4/J5M afterburning turbojets, or 4 Pratt & Whitney JTF-17, a 21L afterburning turbojets, and should have had a top speed of Mach 3 and at least been able to travel at Mach 2.7. It was expected to have had a service ceiling of 76,500 feet, and all of these figures would have elevated the aircraft above Concorde. However, in reality, it was never quite that simple. Why the Boeing was chosen over the L-2000. The FAA was presented with full-scale mock-ups of both aircraft on December 31, 1966, and both were certainly promising designs. However, it was the Boeing 2707 that would ultimately be selected to be America's first SST. The driving force behind that was really down to the fact that the L-2000's expected performance at takeoff and high speed would be lower than that of the 2707, and the Pratt & Whitney engines were expected to be louder than the power plants set to be used on the 2707. The more advanced nature of the design also helped Boeing out, elevating it further above Concorde. America simply didn't want Britain to get any form of a dominant role in the commercial aviation sector. However, these decisions would ultimately work against the Boeing 2707. Boeing was forced to move away from the swing-wing design to a simpler delta wing like the L-2000, this time with a tail, to save costs and cut down on complexity. The FAA had even acknowledged in 1966 that the L-2000 represented a less risky and simpler design and would ultimately be simpler to produce. The desperation to really one-up the British and the French was, in the end, what really cost Lockheed with their design. But what if that hadn't been the case? A potential lost design. There is probably a higher likelihood that the L-2000 could have at least made it to the prototype stage had it been chosen over the Boeing design. Its simpler approach and design meant there were fewer complexities to get over. However, costs no doubt would have spiraled out of control anyway. The predicted speed of Mach 3 was also probably too ambitious. In the end, the Boeing 2707 project was canceled on May 20th, 1971, after Congress stopped federal funding for the project. The SST landscape had changed, with sonic booms banning overland SST flights and Concorde's order book dried up. The focus soon turned to the likes of the Boeing 747 and other large airliners. The L-2000, though, remains a great what-if in aviation, and bar some wooden mock-ups, it never got the chance to prove itself to the world.